Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we look into ceasefire or stalemate. What's next for Gaza? Let's get started. It has been a few weeks since we spoke about the ceasefire deal in Gaza, and I guess what the next steps are. Not surprisingly, you might have forgotten about the fact that the Gaza war technically isn't really over. There's a temporary ceasefire with a plan for the future, but in theory, the war is still on. It's understandable the fact that it's not showing up in the news as much because the Hollywood fake press about the genocide and all of that isn't really news anymore. So we often don't really hear anything about it. But I can assure you that things are definitely happening still in Gaza, despite the fact that you don't hear about it. So I think it's important on this episode to make sure that we talk about what's been going on, things you might not have been hearing about, because it is very important considering this could shape the future of the Middle East, and we could go back to war. For those of you who have studied this history, you know that this is not the first ceasefire in the history of Gaza and Israel. This is somewhat par for the course for every conflict that Hamas starts. Hamas starts a fight, they end up eventually getting destroyed as much as Israel is allowed to destroy them. The international world caves to the pressure of supposed genocide and starvation and all of the things we saw this time. Israel will achieve whatever little goals it can before that world pressure gets too much. And then we have a ceasefire that will last until essentially Hamas is ready to fight again. Ceasefires have always been temporary, at least for Hamas. The only reason why this ceasefire seemed different was because we thought that it had more teeth behind it. We had a much longer term plan, other than just simply the ceasing of fire. And we had a plan to demilitarize and to create a Gaza that won't be a future issue for Israel, and therefore be a safer place for both Jews and the Gazans. I have said for many years that the biggest issue in Gaza for the Gazan people is this cycle of violence, is the fact that their leadership will spend all of its money not helping its people, only making sure it prepares for the next war that they plan with Israel. And then the cycle repeats. But this time was supposed to be different. But we're realizing it's not that different after all. At least not so far. The current stalemate, unfortunately as it is now, is kind of what we saw in the past. Everyone just goes back to normal. No one hears about it in the news. The issues kind of simmer under the surface. Gaza gets rebuilt to some extent. And then Hamas stays in power. We haven't really seen yet anything different. And I fear that we might not. So let's see what is exactly happening on the ground today. If this is going to actually be a permanent ceasefire like Trump and the world promised, or if this is just a regular ceasefire like we had every other time. Some of you may have heard, or maybe didn't hear, that on November 17th, the United Nations Security Council agreed to the Trump plan. This was actually big news, as usually the Security Council doesn't agree on anything. But this time, they actually agreed, and they put the Trump plan for Gaza into action, which includes many things like an international security forces group that will be made up of various countries who will go in and ensure safety and security for both sides. This was supposed to be phase 2 of the Trump plan. Technically speaking, we're not exactly done phase 1 yet, which is unfortunate, because as part of phase 1, Hamas and PIJ and the other groups were supposed to release every living and dead hostage within 72 hours. Unfortunately, it's a tad longer than 72 hours because Hamas plays games, PIJ was handing over non-Israeli bodies, who the heck knows who these people are, and Israel was checking their DNA to find out that they're not even hostages. They just handed over random bodies to pretend that they're complying with the deal, but they weren't. Thankfully, we are only down to, I believe, 1 hostage as of the recording of this episode. Despite the fact that it was a very long time, it seems like phase 1 might be coming to an end. All hostages are back. Israel has moved back to the yellow line. And so, hopefully, people are thinking that phase 2 will begin shortly. Unfortunately for many, this might not be the case. If you recall from some of our earlier episodes on the deal, Phase 2 would require Hamas to give up power, disarm, demilitarize, and even in some cases, leave the area. Those who want to stay have to be peaceful and give up power. However, this week we found out that the leader of Hamas, the one still alive living in Qatar, he said in a video address in Istanbul that Hamas will not disarm, will not give up its weapons, will continue to rule the Gaza Strip, and will not permit external oversight of Gaza, which includes the International Stabilizing Force. So essentially suggesting that everything they had agreed to when they signed the deal for this current ceasefire, they are saying they will not do. Don't ask me how you can agree to a ceasefire and then disagree with every point made in that ceasefire that you agreed to. But I guess we're dealing with terrorists here. So obviously this causes a little bit of a concern for those people looking to get to Phase 2, which would require Hamas to do literally everything they just said they will not do. So where does that leave us? Despite the fact that Hamas is saying openly that they will not support any of this stuff, they have also been actively breaking the ceasefire and attacking Israel across the yellow line. There have been dozens of attempted attacks against Israeli soldiers on the opposite side of the yellow line, where they are supposed to be in a ceasefire. Hamas doesn't really care to uphold that part of the ceasefire either. Of course, that's followed by some retaliation from the Israelis, who are obviously going to strike back at Hamas trying to kill their soldiers, and then the international world likes to blame Israel for breaking the ceasefire. So you can kind of see here that this is why I personally call it more of a stalemate than a ceasefire. The two sides are technically still fighting. The deal for the next phase is technically not going to happen because one side who agreed to it already says they will not do what they were supposed to do. So is this even a ceasefire anymore? Where is this deal headed? Despite the fact that Hamas has openly said they will not agree to the deal that they technically already agreed to, the Americans, even the Israelis to some extent, and some of the Middle East negotiators have decided they will still go forward with Phase 2 as best they can. With Phase 2, it would require not only the starting to rebuild of Gaza for the Gazan people, but they also need to create this ISF, International Security Force. The International Security Force needs to be manned with people who are not Israeli, who will replace the Israelis on the line in order to stop Israelis from having to fight back and defend themselves. One of the major issues with this is the fact that despite all of these countries signing on to this peace deal, ironically, or smartly, not a single one has signed up to be part of the ISF. There were a lot of pledges at first, some countries saying that they supported the idea or that they would join in, but when push comes to shove and the rubber hits the road, they're nowhere to be found. In one example provided by the Washington Post, the Indonesian president said in September that they would give 20,000 peacekeepers to send to Gaza as a part of the ISF. However, apparently they've had some cold feet. Supposedly, they are only prepared to send, at this point, 1,200 people, claiming that this is going to be a reconnaissance mission to sort of see what the world needs them to do, and then decide what they were going to send to Gaza, if anything. We also had Azerbaijan, who said that they would send many troops over, and then realized when they'd have to fight Hamas, they backed out and said that they won't be sending any of their troops. And in a last example of this exact problem, is that the United Arab Emirates, who also said that they would send troops to this ISF force, has now said that they don't see the clear framework that's being set up for the ISF forces, and therefore they're going to wait and see until this is actually planned out. They also are not going to be sending troops. In the past, statements from Saudi Arabia and others have said that until Hamas is actually finished and will not put the other Arab troops at risk, they are not going to send their troops in there, which is understandable. So they've suggested Israel needed to finish Hamas until it was just a peacekeeping mission, not an active military zone. So it's pretty crazy to think that this ISF plan is essentially going nowhere, because as long as Hamas refuses to give up, there's nobody who's willing to send their soldiers in to go and die trying to fight Hamas. And if there's no ISF, then that means Hamas just gets to continue to survive. It'll stay in this stalemate that we're currently in. As a society, as a world, if we want peace in this area, we have to decide what we want. Do we want Hamas gone, like we all agreed to? which might require Israel to finish the job because nobody else wants to do it and Hamas is clearly not giving up on its own? Or are we actually going to consider possibly sending in an ISF force, if we can even find any soldiers, to go and just live alongside Hamas? Kind of like UNIFIL with Hezbollah? We've talked about that on the podcast before. World UN soldiers who literally sat next to Hezbollah fighters putting tunnels and weapons for their next fight with Israel. Is that what we want in Gaza? So it kind of seems like phase 2 is doomed to fail right from the start. Hamas is ignoring the fact that they agreed to it, and the world isn't going to be willing to actually put this into action, but at the same time also not let Israel finish the job, to then allow it to be peaceful in Gaza and allow the ISF to go in and actually do a peacekeeping mission. And Hamas aren't the only people who are lying here. We had the entire Middle East come together and decide that they were going to support the rebuilding of Gaza. People like the Saudis, UAE, many people said that they were going to fund the rebuilding of Gaza. That was part of the deal. In a recent article from the Times of Israel, they are reporting that the Qatari Prime Minister suggested that his country will not foot the bill for rebuilding Gaza. And he said, I quote, "We are not the ones who are going to write the check to rebuild what others destroyed." I hate to point out the very clear, obvious irony here is the fact that his country funded Hamas, which funded the October 7th attack, which then led to the destruction that they claim that they are not going to rebuild. The irony in the fact that this was essentially caused by them, but they are saying they won't pay for it, despite the fact that they, as part of Trump's plan, said that they, along with other Gulf states, would pay for it. And it seems like they're all finding a way to back out. They are claiming that they are waiting for some type of official Palestinian statehood, then they'll pay for it, or some other lie that they'll tell because they don't want to pay for it, despite the fact that they had agreed to do so. Surely they have now decided that they are going to just back away and let the Europeans pay for it, or the Americans, or worse, they are trying to punish Israel and making them pay for it. What is kind of interesting here is why everyone believes that Israel is responsible to pay to fix this. If you look not that long ago, only in 2021, the Iraqi government finished paying off their $52 billion war reparations to Kuwait from the 1990s war. The person who started the war had to pay the person who got devastated by the war. And therefore, if you use that same model, the Gazans, or the Palestinian Authority, would have to repay to build Gaza. And even, some could suggest, to repay all of the damage done in Israel, because they started the war. So it is somewhat ironic that Qatar, who funds the Palestinian Authority and especially Hamas, who started the war by funding the terrorism, is now claiming we're not responsible to pay the bill. Meanwhile, as we see in history, Germany, Iraq, all of these countries that started wars and damaged things had to pay to fix it, not the person who was attacked. But as always the case when it deals with Israel and the Jews, everything is backwards. So in normal war, when the aggressor and the person who starts the war has to pay the bill, when it comes to Jews, nope, the victim gets to pay the bill. And it's not like the Palestinian Arabs don't have money. Qatar has been pumping an estimated $1.8 billion into Gaza since Hamas's takeover of the Strip. Qatar pledged $360 million of annual support for Hamas. But now apparently they don't want to spend any money to help the people of Gaza? It's quite convenient. And that's not even including Iran, who also sends up to $222 million to Hamas directly between 2014 and 2020. So this idea that they don't want to help support or fund the rebuilding of Gaza is a total crock of shit. They are simply just doing the age-old Arab trick of causing a problem, getting the world to blame Israel for that problem, and then leaving that problem to the Israelis to solve when they didn't start it in the first place. And this doesn't even include the donations from United States and the European Union, which between 1994 to 2017, the US has given the Palestinian Arabs $5.7 billion, and the Europeans $6.7 billion. Maybe that could be used to rebuild Gaza, wherever that money ended up. In reality, the Arab world wants to see the West have to pay for this. Or even better, let Israel pay for it. They don't want to have to pay for it, even if they agreed to do it. They really only want to send money for Hamas and terrorism. They don't want it to go to actual people or fixing the buildings. That's money wasted for them. In the end, this ceasefire really has nothing to do with actual ceasefire. People are still fighting. We are still taking out tons of Hamas members, which is amazing. They haven't stopped trying to kill Israelis. And Hamas is refusing essentially to do anything involved with phase 2. So where is the actual ceasefire? At this point, it kind of just seems like a stalemate, a wait and see. Let's wait you out and decide when you're going to give up trying to get rid of us so we can just go back to business as usual. Are we really going to see an ISF, an international security force, arrive in Gaza in order to replace the IDF? Are we going to see that force turn into something like UNIFIL, who are going to allow Hamas to rebuild and grow and create a terror state within their region, much like we saw in Lebanon? At this point, it kind of feels like the world is just going back to normal. Let's all pretend the war's over. Let's not talk about it. Let's sort of let things lie as they are. We don't want any more killing or anybody getting hurt. Let's just sort of close our eyes to the reality, which is that the ceasefire isn't working, and one side of that ceasefire has pretty much ignored what they had agreed to. As long as the world doesn't hear or see about all the problems going on in Gaza, we'll just do the exact same thing we did for every previous ceasefire, which is let things go back to normal, let Hamas stay in power, we'll wait another couple years until they can regroup, get paid by Qatar and by Iran, start another war, and we repeat this entire thing over and over again. It's unbelievable that we're actually almost falling into that same trap. All because the international world wants to pretend that there's peace in the Middle East and that everything is all good. They will kick the can down the road, and 5 years we'll deal with it again later, even though so much had been done to get us into a new path. It is possible that the reason we're heading down this same path is because it's intended that way by the people who are signing these deals. This isn't the first time we've dealt with this specific issue. It's actually a repeated issue for centuries. In fact, when Yasser Arafat, the leader of the PLO, made the Oslo peace accords with Israel, one people promote today as such an amazing achievement, we're going to have peace in the Middle East, which has led to none of that. He said in a statement made in Johannesburg in 1994, shortly after he signed the deal, quote, "I'm not considering this agreement more than the agreement which had been signed between the Prophet Muhammad at Quraysh, and you remember that Caliph Omar had refused this agreement and considered it sulha daniya, a despicable truce, but Muhammad had accepted it, and we are accepting now this Oslo peace accord." For Western audiences, this probably means very little to you. If you are an Arab and a Muslim, you would know that he is referring to the treaty that had a 10-year truce between Muhammad and a Quraysh tribe. And after this temporary truce was in place for only 2 years, the Muslims destroyed and attacked the people that they had made a deal with. His very clear reference here is that they will make peace just to say, yeah, sure, we'll have peace with you. You stop fighting. We might stop fighting for a little bit, but that's only until we can actually achieve our goal. These truces, these ceasefires, these deals that they agree to, sign on the dotted line, are temporary. It is just something they do in order to achieve their final goal. So, do we have any hope that Hamas is going to give up, disarm, leave Gaza? Truthfully, they're pretty clear they're not planning on doing it. So the only way out would be for somebody to go in and actually take care of business. If it's not the ISF because they refuse to actually fight against Hamas, understandably, they don't want their soldiers to be killed in an Arab-on-Arab conflict. Ironically, they kill each other all over the Middle East, no problem, but in Gaza, they don't want to do it. So it really seems like we can't allow this to turn into yet another stalemate where Hamas gets to wait and wait until they're ready again and start another fight and start another war. We need to either end this stalemate or end the ceasefire. The ceasefire that the other side had already said is over long ago, minutes after they had signed and agreed to it. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.